December 16, 1944, saw German artillery open fire across 85 miles of American front line in the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg, launching what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate final offensive in the West that caught American forces completely by surprise during what was supposed to be a quiet sector where green divisions went for easy introduction to combat and exhausted veterans rested after brutal fighting elsewhere. But what turned this already catastrophic surprise attack into an unimaginable nightmare was not just the sudden appearance of 25 German divisions, including elite SS Panzer units smashing through thin American lines. It was the weather, specifically the coldest European winter in 50 years, with temperatures plunging to -30 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas, turning the Ardennes into frozen hell, where American soldiers would lose more men to frostbite and cold-related injuries than to enemy bullets, where fingers and toes turned black and fell off overnight, where medics performed amputations with bayonets because surgical instruments froze, where entire units ceased to exist, not because Germans killed them, but because winter destroyed them first. The numbers are staggering and still classified in many cases because the U.S. Army never wanted to admit the full scale of the cold weather catastrophe. Official records acknowledge approximately 15,000 cases of severe frostbite, requiring medical evacuation during December 1944 alone. But this number only counts cases severe enough to require rear-echelon hospital treatment. It does not count thousands of cases treated at aid stations and returned to duty with missing toes or fingers, does not count soldiers who died from exposure and were listed as killed in action, does not count men who suffered less severe frostbite but remained in combat with damaged extremities that would cause lifelong problems, and most significantly, does not count the psychological casualties who broke mentally not from combat stress, but from the relentless cold that made every minute of existence torture. When you account for all categories of cold weather casualties, including trench foot, which is technically distinct from frostbite, but caused by same conditions, the total number of American soldiers removed from combat effectiveness due to winter conditions during the Battle of the Bulge approaches 100,000 men, an entire army destroyed by temperature. This was not supposed to happen because the U.S. Army had extensive experience fighting in cold weather from World War I, when trench foot disabled thousands in muddy trenches of France, from North Africa, where desert nights dropped to freezing, from Italian mountains where winter warfare taught brutal lessons about protecting soldiers from elements, and from planning for eventual invasion of Germany, which everyone knew would involve winter fighting. Yet, despite all this experience and all this planning, American forces entering the Battle of the Bulge were catastrophically unprepared for the cold weather they encountered. And the reasons why form a case study in military bureaucracy, failing soldiers at the worst possible moment, while also revealing how weather can be as deadly as any enemy weapon when conditions align perfectly to maximize human suffering. The story begins months before the battle when U.S. Army quartermaster units responsible for supplying winter clothing to combat troops faced a series of cascading problems that would prove fatal come December. First problem was simple logistics, since by autumn 1944, the Allied advance across France after D-Day had outrun supply lines dramatically, with frontline units sometimes 300 miles ahead of their supply bases. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every ration had to be trucked forward, over roads clogged with military traffic and damaged by months of combat. Priority naturally went to ammunition and fuel, because without those items, soldiers could not fight at all. Winter clothing seemed less urgent, especially given that Allied commanders expected the war to end before winter set in, with optimistic predictions that Germany would collapse by Christmas, making cold weather gear unnecessary. This optimism was not entirely unreasonable, since by September, Allied forces had liberated Paris, crossed the Seine, and were racing toward German border with Wehrmacht in apparent disarray after catastrophic losses in Normandy. Second problem was production, because even when Quartermaster realized winter clothing would be needed after all, manufacturing capacity was already strained, producing everything else the Army required: wool overshoes called shoe packs that were supposed to prevent trench foot were in particularly short supply since factories had prioritized combat boots over specialized cold-weather footwear. Heavy wool overcoats existed in depots, but shipping them forward meant taking space on supply trucks that otherwise would carry ammunition. And, most critically, there was no systematic plan for distributing whatever winter gear did reach theater, because Army had assumed front line would be further east in Germany proper by winter, where captured German supplies might supplement American equipment. Instead, the surprise German offensive in Ardennes caught American units in their existing positions without time to properly equip for sustained winter operations. Third problem was experience, because the divisions hit hardest by Battle of the Bulge included many units with minimal combat experience. The Ardennes sector had been deliberately chosen as quiet area where green troops could gain exposure to frontline conditions without facing serious German pressure. The veteran 106th Infantry Division had just arrived from United States and barely settled into positions when German attacks struck. The 28th Infantry Division was resting and refitting after brutal combat in Hurtgen Forest. The 99th Infantry Division had only been in combat for few weeks. These inexperienced units not only lacked winter warfare training, but many individual soldiers had never experienced serious cold weather at all, since wartime conscription drew from across United States, including men from southern states who had no personal knowledge of how to protect themselves from freezing temperatures. They simply did not know that you must keep moving in extreme cold, that wet socks will freeze your feet, that you must eat constantly to maintain body heat, that you never touch metal with bare hands in sub-zero temperatures. These seem like common sense to anyone from northern climates, but were completely unknown to soldiers from places like Texas, or Alabama, or Florida. The weather itself was historically extreme by any measure, with the winter of 1944 to 1945 being the coldest in Europe since 1895. Temperatures in the Ardennes region, which is mountainous terrain in eastern Belgium and northern Luxembourg, regularly dropped below 0 Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing effective temperature to -30 or lower on worst nights. Heavy snow fell repeatedly through December and January, creating drifts several feet deep that made movement almost impossible. And most devastating were the alternating cycles of freeze and thaw that created layer upon layer of ice, coating everything from tree branches to tank treads to soldiers' uniforms. This ice was not like snow that could be brushed off, but rather hard crystalline coating that turned fabric stiff and sharp, made it impossible to dig foxholes in frozen ground, and constantly melted slightly during day only to refreeze at night, creating permanent dampness that accelerated heat loss from human bodies. When German offensive struck on December 16th, most American units were already suffering from cold weather even before combat began. Soldiers had been enduring sub-freezing temperatures for weeks with inadequate clothing. Many were already showing early signs of frostbite, though few realized it, since initial symptoms are numbness and tingling that soldiers attributed to normal cold rather than recognizing as tissue damage. Trench foot was epidemic in foxholes where men stood in icy water or snow for days at a time, unable to dry their feet. And the surprise German attack immediately made everything worse, because combat operations prevented any systematic effort to warm soldiers, evacuate cold casualties, or implement cold weather protocols that might have mitigated the crisis. The 106th Infantry Division, positioned in Schnee-Eifel region of Belgium, took the initial brunt of both German offensive and winter weather. When German attack came, this division, with almost no combat experience, suddenly found itself cut off and surrounded by advancing panzer units, while simultaneously fighting temperatures that dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Two entire regiments of the division, totaling over 8,000 men, were forced to surrender on December 19th after being encircled and running out of ammunition and supplies. But before that surrender occurred, thousands of soldiers suffered severe frostbite because they had no choice but to remain in exposed positions under German fire in the worst possible weather conditions. After the surrender, German captors found American prisoners with blackened fingers and toes that had frozen solid. Many prisoners could not walk because their feet had frozen in their boots and swollen so badly that removing boots tore skin. German guards actually expressed shock at how badly equipped the Americans were for winter conditions, since Wehrmacht troops had learned brutal lessons about cold weather fighting from Russia and issued appropriate gear. The 101st Airborne Division, encircled at Bastogne, became legendary for their defense against overwhelming German forces, but the reality of that siege included horrific cold weather casualties that are less celebrated in official histories. Paratroopers were elite troops with better training and morale than average infantry. But they still had to endure same weather in foxholes and improvised positions around the town. Temperatures during the Bastogne siege ranged from 0 to -15 Fahrenheit, with heavy snow falling on most days. Paratroopers had no heavy winter clothing because they had been rushed to Bastogne by truck when German breakthrough threatened the town and had not had time to draw proper equipment from supply depots. Many were still wearing the lightweight uniforms they had used for Holland airborne operation in September. And for an entire week, they could not be resupplied because weather kept aircraft grounded, meaning no food, no ammunition, no medical supplies, and no winter clothing could be brought in. Medical personnel treating frostbite casualties quickly realized they faced crisis beyond their capacity to handle, because standard cold injury treatment requires warming the affected tissue gradually in temperature-controlled environment using water baths and careful monitoring. But aid stations in combat zone had no heated facilities, no running water, often no heat at all beyond small stoves that might warm one room in a damaged building. Medics had to treat frostbite victims in conditions not much better than the frozen foxholes the soldiers came from, and the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed available medical staff, since a single rifle company of 200 men might see 50 cases of frostbite in one day during the worst weather. Medics had to perform emergency amputations on fingers and toes that had frozen completely and would turn gangrenous if not removed. These amputations were done without proper surgical tools, using whatever sharp instruments were available, including bayonets, without anesthesia beyond alcohol, since morphine supply was reserved for combat wounded, and often without follow-up care, since the soldier had to return to his unit because there were not enough replacements to pull every frostbite victim out of the line. The psychological impact of cold casualties was devastating to unit cohesion and morale, because soldiers could accept being killed by enemy action as part of combat. But watching men around you lose toes and fingers to weather felt like betrayal, since the cold was something the army should have protected them from, but did not. Soldiers began to lose faith in their leadership when they saw that German troops attacking them were better equipped for winter, with proper overcoats, insulated boots, and layered clothing, while Americans shivered in summer-weight uniforms. And most corrosively, men realized that senior officers at headquarters were warm, while combat soldiers froze, since every echelon above battalion lived in heated buildings with hot food and dry clothes. This created resentment that lasted beyond the war, with many Bulge veterans expressing more anger about the cold than about German attacks, because at least the enemy was trying to kill them, which made sense. The weather killing them while their own army failed to provide basic protection made no sense. Trench foot became as significant a problem as pure frostbite, because while frostbite is tissue freezing from extreme cold, trench foot is tissue damage from prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions above freezing. It develops when feet remain wet and cold for extended period, typically 24 hours or more. causing blood vessels to constrict and reducing blood flow until tissue begins to die, even though it never actually freezes. Symptoms include swelling, numbness, tingling, and eventually open sores that can become gangrenous if untreated. And prevention is straightforward, requiring soldiers to keep feet dry by changing socks regularly. But this simple prevention was impossible in Battle of the Bulge conditions because soldiers were in combat positions for days or weeks without relief, could not remove boots in foxholes because German snipers would shoot them, had no dry socks because supply system had collapsed, and even when medics distributed preventive measures like foot powder or instructed men to massage their feet regularly, combat operations meant soldiers could not take time to do these things. The impact on combat effectiveness was catastrophic because a soldier with frostbitten toes cannot march, cannot run from cover to cover, cannot even stand guard properly since the pain and numbness make walking agony. An entire squad with trench foot becomes combat ineffective even if they retain their weapons and ammunition. And the cold casualties were concentrated in frontline rifle companies, which were already undermanned since U.S. Army replacement system was failing to provide sufficient infantry replacements to make up combat losses. By late December, many rifle companies that should have had 200 men were down to 80 or 90 effectives, and of those many were suffering from frostbite in various stages. This meant that when German attacks came, the actual number of American soldiers capable of fighting back was far lower than order of battle suggested, creating situations where entire positions collapsed, not because Germans broke through, but because Americans could not physically defend them. The Christmas period of December 1944 was particularly brutal because the weather reached its worst point during the days when 101st Airborne at Bastogne and other surrounded American units were making their most desperate stands. Snow fell continuously for 72 hours starting December 22nd, creating whiteout conditions that prevented any aerial resupply or air support. Temperatures dropped to their lowest point of the entire battle, with thermometers showing -20 Fahrenheit in some positions. And soldiers who had already endured weeks of cold were now facing conditions beyond anything they had experienced. Many soldiers lost consciousness from hypothermia while at their positions and were found frozen to death at their posts, still holding weapons. Some units reported entire machine gun crews frozen solid in their fighting positions, discovered when relief forces finally reached them. And the Christmas day itself was coldest of all, with clear skies, after the storm creating beautiful winter scenery that masked the fact that this clear cold weather was killing more men than the earlier storm. Medical evacuation of cold casualties presented impossible choices, because the wounded from combat required immediate evacuation to save lives, but frostbite victims also needed evacuation to prevent permanent injury or death from gangrene, and there were not enough ambulances or medical evacuation vehicles to handle both categories. Medics had to triage, deciding which cold casualties were severe enough to warrant precious evacuation space versus which could be treated in place. And this triage created situations where soldiers with relatively severe frostbite were kept in frontline aid stations because they were not actively dying while soldiers with minor wounds were evacuated. The long-term result was that many men who could have saved their toes or fingers with proper early treatment instead suffered permanent disability because they were held forward too long waiting for evacuation that never came. The Army's official preventive medicine policies for cold weather were comprehensive and would have prevented most casualties if implemented. Regulations required that soldiers change socks daily, that units rotate men out of exposed positions every few hours to warm up in heated shelters, that hot food be provided at least once daily, that soldiers receive instruction in cold weather injury prevention, that specialized winter clothing, including insulated boots, be issued before cold weather operations, that medics inspect soldiers' feet regularly for early signs of injury, that commanders actively monitor and enforce cold weather discipline. But none of these regulations could be implemented during Battle of the Bulge because the situation made compliance impossible. There were no heated shelters to rotate into, no hot food because field kitchens could not operate under German artillery fire, no dry socks because supply trucks could not reach forward positions, no time for foot inspections because units were in constant contact with enemy, and no winter clothing because it had never been shipped forward in first place. Individual soldiers improvised desperate measures to protect themselves from cold, using whatever materials they could find or salvage. Some wrapped their feet in newspapers before putting boots on to create insulation layer. Some stole blankets from abandoned Belgian houses and cut them up to make improvised capes. Some burned furniture from damaged buildings in their foxholes, despite this revealing position to Germans. Some captured German winter clothing from dead enemy soldiers, with German wool overcoats becoming prized possessions. Some used parachute silk from supply drops to create wind-breaking layers, and some simply accepted that they were going to lose toes or fingers and focused on keeping hands and feet functional enough to fight even if permanent damage occurred. This acceptance of inevitable injury created grim determination, where men would look down at blackened frostbitten toes and shrug, saying at least it was not worse. The breaking of the weather and German offensive came together in late December, when skies cleared, allowing Allied aircraft to finally fly in support of ground forces. The same clear weather that enabled air operations also made the cold more severe, since clear winter skies mean lowest temperatures. But the psychological boost of seeing Allied planes and receiving airdropped supplies outweighed the worse cold for most soldiers. Supply drops began including winter clothing for the first time, with overcoats, wool socks, insulated boots, and even hand warmers being parachuted to surrounded units. And though this equipment came too late to prevent the cold weather casualties that had already occurred, it did prevent the situation from becoming even worse and allowed the Army to stabilize the medical crisis. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge revealed the full scope of the cold weather disaster. When casualty statistics were compiled in January and February 1945, official figures acknowledged approximately 12,000 American soldiers evacuated specifically for frostbite during the battle, with another 3,000 evacuated for trench foot. But these numbers vastly understated reality, because they only counted men who reached evacuation hospitals. Division medical logs show that thousands more were treated at forward aid stations and returned to duty despite having suffered frostbite, because manpower shortage meant every soldier who could still pull a trigger stayed on the line. And the long-term medical impact was staggering, with thousands of Bulge veterans suffering permanent loss of toes or fingers, chronic pain from frostbite damage, and circulatory problems that would plague them for the rest of their lives. Some had to be medically discharged from service when the full extent of their injuries became apparent months later, and many became disabled veterans entitled to lifetime benefits because their cold injuries prevented them from working in civilian life. The military investigation into the cold weather casualties began immediately after the battle, when it became obvious that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Multiple factors were identified, including the failure to ship winter clothing forward during autumn when weather permitted, the optimistic assumption that war would end before winter, making cold weather equipment unnecessary, the logistical focus on ammunition and fuel to exclusion of other supplies, the placement of inexperienced divisions in the Ardennes sector without proper cold weather training, the surprise German offensive preventing any systematic cold weather preparation, and the historically extreme weather that exceeded anything planners had anticipated. But the investigation also revealed systematic failures in the Army's replacement system, since many soldiers arrived at frontline units so quickly they had no time to draw proper equipment. In the medical service, since aid stations were not adequately stocked with materials needed to treat cold injuries, and in command culture, since many senior officers were not personally exposed to cold conditions experienced by frontline troops, and therefore underestimated the severity of the problem. The lessons learned from the Battle of the Bulge cold weather disaster influenced U.S. military cold weather doctrine for decades afterward, with the Army establishing specialized cold weather training centers, developing improved winter clothing including the famous Mickey Mouse boots with inflatable insulation, creating detailed medical protocols for preventing and treating cold injuries, and most importantly, mandating that cold weather considerations be given same priority as combat operations when planning winter campaigns. But these improvements came too late for the 100,000 men who suffered during that terrible winter of 1944 to 1945, when America learned that weather can destroy armies just as thoroughly as enemy action, that logistics and planning matter as much as courage and firepower, and that taking care of soldiers' basic needs is not a luxury, but a combat requirement because frozen soldiers cannot fight regardless of how brave they might be. The human stories from that winter are heartbreaking in their details, with letters home describing the cold in terms that families could barely comprehend, soldiers writing that their feet hurt so badly they cried, that they could not feel their fingers for days at a time, that they were more afraid of losing toes to frostbite than of being shot by Germans, because at least a bullet wound might get them evacuated to warmth. Some soldiers deliberately exposed themselves to German fire, hoping to receive minor wound that would get them sent to rear area hospital where it was warm. Others shot themselves in foot when cold became unbearable, creating self-inflicted wound casualties that Army tried to hide because they demonstrated how desperate conditions had become, and still others simply gave up and stopped trying to stay warm. Accepting death from exposure as preferable to continued suffering, these psychological casualties were rarely recorded as such in official records, but represent significant portion of the men who died during the battle with cause of death listed as killed in action, when reality was they froze to death because they lacked will to keep fighting the cold. The comparison to German casualties from cold weather during the Battle of the Bulge is revealing because Wehrmacht units attacking through Ardennes suffered far fewer cold weather casualties despite operating in same conditions and often being even more exposed than defending Americans, since attackers must move while defenders can stay in prepared positions. German troops had learned brutal lessons about winter warfare from Eastern Front, where temperatures in Russia made Ardennes look mild by comparison. German Army issued proper winter clothing, including heavy wool overcoats, insulated boots, layered underwear, and even face protection. German doctrine emphasized cold weather discipline with severe punishments for soldiers who allowed themselves to become cold casualties through negligence. And German soldiers were simply more experienced with cold conditions, since most had spent at least one winter fighting in Russia, where failure to protect yourself from cold meant death. This disparity in cold weather casualties between German attackers and American defenders became embarrassing for U.S. Army when analyzed after battle, since it demonstrated that the problem was not the cold itself, but inadequate preparation and supply. The racial dimension of cold weather casualties adds another layer of tragedy to the story because African American soldiers serving in segregated units during World War II often received even less adequate winter clothing than white troops, since they were discriminated against in distribution of limited supplies. Black soldiers in engineer and quartermaster units, who were working outside in exposed positions, suffered disproportionately high rates of frostbite and trench foot. Some black units reported that their requisitions for winter clothing were repeatedly denied or delayed, while nearby white units received adequate equipment. And the medical treatment of black cold casualties was sometimes inferior, since military hospitals remained segregated with black soldiers directed to less well-equipped facilities. The Army's official statistics do not break down cold weather casualties by race, so the full extent of this disparity is unknown, but anecdotal evidence from unit histories and soldier accounts makes clear that black troops suffered more than their white counterparts from problems that were already catastrophic across entire Army. The long-term impact on survivors of the Battle of the Bulge cold casualties is still being felt today, in 2025, more than 80 years after the battle, as aging veterans deal with chronic health problems that trace directly to frostbite injuries suffered in 1944. Damage to blood vessels and nerves from frostbite never fully heals, creating conditions like Raynaud's phenomenon, where fingers and toes become extremely sensitive to cold for rest of patient's life. Some veterans lost toes or fingers to amputation decades after the war, when circulation problems from old frostbite injuries led to gangrene requiring delayed surgery. Arthritis develops more severely in joints that suffered frostbite, creating chronic pain and psychological trauma from the cold. Experience sometimes overshadowed combat trauma, with veterans reporting nightmares about freezing rather than about German attacks. The Veterans Administration provides disability benefits for frostbite injuries, but proving that chronic health problems in elderly veterans trace back to Battle of the Bulge can be difficult, since medical records from 1944 are often incomplete or lost. The strategic significance of the cold weather casualties during Battle of the Bulge is that they potentially extended the war in Europe by months, because the 100,000 men removed from combat effectiveness by cold injuries represented multiple divisions' worth of combat power that had to be regenerated through the replacement system. If those soldiers had remained effective, the American counterattacks that eventually drove back the German offensive could have come sooner and been more powerful. The breakthrough into Germany that followed the Bulge might have occurred in February rather than March, and the final collapse of Nazi Germany might have come before Hitler's death in April, shortening the war and saving countless lives. This is, of course, speculation, but the reality is that weather casualties had strategic impact comparable to major battle defeat, removing combat power that took months to reconstitute at a time when Allied commanders were trying to finish the war as quickly as possible. The historical memory of the Battle of the Bulge focuses almost entirely on combat operations, with famous episodes like the defense of Bastogne and Patton's relief of the encircled town dominating popular understanding of the battle. But soldiers who fought there remember the cold as vividly as the combat, with many veterans stating that the weather was worse enemy than the Germans. The cold was relentless and inescapable. While German attacks came and went, every minute of every day for 6 weeks, they were cold with no relief, no matter what else was happening. And the knowledge that their army had failed to provide basic protection from winter weather created resentment that lasted a lifetime. Some veterans never forgave the generals and staff officers who made decisions about supply priorities that left combat soldiers without winter clothing. And many felt that the Army's subsequent efforts to improve cold weather equipment and training were implicit admission that someone had made terrible mistakes in winter of 1944 to 45, though no one was ever held accountable. The Battle of the Bulge winter casualties represent one of the great failures of American military logistics in World War II, because unlike defeat in battle, which can result from enemy skill or bad luck, cold weather casualties result from failure to provide soldiers with equipment they need to survive conditions they will face. The Army knew winter was coming, knew the Ardennes was cold region, knew soldiers would need winter clothing, had winter clothing available in rear area depots, but failed to get that equipment to the soldiers who needed it, when they needed it, because supply system prioritized other things. This was bureaucratic failure with life and death consequences that destroyed the combat effectiveness of multiple divisions just as surely as German offensive did. And the lessons from this failure remain relevant for modern military, because logistics is still a challenge when deploying forces to remote or harsh environments. Getting right equipment to right place at right time requires planning, prioritization, and leadership that sometimes fails with catastrophic results. Today, when historians study the Battle of the Bulge, they increasingly include cold weather casualties in their analysis, because understanding of the battle is incomplete. Without accounting for weather as a significant factor, recent scholarship has worked to quantify the cold casualties more accurately using unit medical logs and after-action reports that were not available when early histories were written. And the picture that emerges is of Army that came perilously close to collapse, Not from German attacks, but from winter weather that destroyed cohesion and combat effectiveness of frontline units. If German offensive had come 2 weeks later, when cold casualties had further reduced American strength, or if the weather had remained bad, preventing Allied air support for longer period, the Battle of the Bulge might have ended very differently. The margin between American victory and disaster was narrower than popular history suggests, and weather played a determining role in that margin, even though it rarely appears in dramatic retellings focused on combat heroics. The winter America lost 100,000 men to frostbite was winter that taught painful lesson about hubris and preparation. The U.S. Army entered the Battle of the Bulge, confident that German defeat was inevitable and winter was mere inconvenience. But weather does not care about confidence or inevitability. Temperature drops according to physics, not propaganda. Human tissue freezes at specific temperatures regardless of nationality or cause, and soldiers without proper equipment will become casualties no matter how righteous their fight might be. This is reality that armies throughout history have learned and relearned at terrible cost. The American Army of World War II learned it in Ardennes Forest during December 1944 and January 1945, when 100,000 young men paid price for someone else's optimism and someone else's failure to plan. Those men fought bravely and most survived, but they carry scars from that winter, both physical and psychological, that remind us weather can be as deadly as any weapon. And caring for soldiers is not bureaucratic detail, but fundamental requirement of military operations.